The morning Nora Gilroy arrived at Ashwick Park, the ground was wet with a frost that had not quite decided to become snow. She came on foot from the village, her trunk carried behind her by the publican's boy, her good coat pressed, and her hair dressed as neatly as the wind would permit. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a country schoolmaster who had died the previous winter and left her nothing but his dictionary and his manners. Both she carried into the great house as though they were currency. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pelling, received her in the servants' hall with the particular efficiency of a woman who had no time for nerves. She walked Nora through the house regulations in 8 minutes and assigned her to the upper corridor, the one responsible for the family's private apartments. This was not, as Nora would come to understand, a compliment. It was the corridor the Duchess of Ashwick watched most closely. The Duchess had arrived at Ashwick Park 4 years before as the second wife of the old Duke, who had died inside the year and left behind him a son from his first marriage, a mountain of entail, and a widow whose legal position in the house was now entirely dependent on the goodwill of that son. Her Grace, Duchess Cornelia Pethwick Lyons, had survived 3 seasons of that son's absence by managing Ashwick as though it were her own estate, and she had no intention of relinquishing what she had built. She required staff who understood their place. When they did not, she had ways of making the matter clear. Nora had been in service for 4 days when she understood this. The amber brooch went missing on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the Duchess had informed Mrs. Pelling that she had observed the new maid in the east corridor near the dressing room at precisely the hour the piece was last seen on the vanity table. She did not say she had seen Nora take it. She said, with the measured precision of a woman who understood what words could carry without quite saying, that she felt it wise to bring the matter to the housekeeper's attention. After all, one could not be too careful. Not with new girls. Not with girls who came without references from anyone of consequence. If something in Nora stilled when Mrs. Pelling called her to the study, it did not reach her face. She stood with her hands folded and her eyes clear, and she said she had no knowledge of the brooch, that she had been in the east corridor changing the linens as her schedule required, and that she was sorry for her Grace's loss, but could not account for what she had not touched. Mrs. Pelling believed her. The Duchess did not. There were others who might have been asked. If one looked past Cornelia Pethwick Lyons for even a moment, one might notice that the footman Taggart had been dismissed from his prior position under ambiguous circumstances, that the Duchess's lady's maid had been with her employer for 11 years, and thus lived and fell with her mistress's reputation, and that the amber brooch was a piece Cornelia had always disliked. It was the first Duchess's jewel. The present Duchess had worn it twice in public, at events where to omit it would have given the county something to murmur about, and then it had lived in the dressing-room drawer with the air of a thing that was being kept rather than cherished. The brooch reappeared on Sunday. It was on the dressing-room floor behind the vanity's leg, in a position a maid conscientiously sweeping would eventually find it. Nora found it. She brought it directly to Mrs. Pelling. She did not know, then, what the finding of it would cost her. What she could not know, either, was that she had not been alone in the corridor that morning. The Duke had returned from the stables before the breakfast hour, a habit of his that the household had not yet readjusted its rhythms to accommodate, and he had been in the passage outside the morning room when he heard the sweep of the brush on the baseboards, and then the particular stillness of someone who has found something unexpected. He had stood at the angle of the corridor wall and watched through the open doorway as Nora crouched behind the vanity leg, lifted the amber brooch with a cloth rather than her bare hand, turned it once to identify it, and then straightened and stood with the stillness of a person who has arrived at a decision. She had not looked around the room to see if she was observed. she had not hesitated in the corridor. She had gone directly to Mrs. Pelling, which was the correct thing to do, and also, given the climate of the house at that moment, the costly thing to do, because a woman less principled or less clear-headed about her own situation might have put the brooch back where she found it, and said nothing, which would have been safer. Nora brought it forward instead, with no audience, and no expectation of reward. The Duke had gone back down to the stables, and said nothing to anyone. If you have ever stood in a house that has decided what you are, you will know the particular quality of the silence that surrounds a person so decided upon. It is not loud, it does not announce itself. It is simply that the footman does not meet your eye in the corridor, and the laundry-maid trails off when you enter the room, and the cold draught in the servants' hall seems to settle around your chair alone. Nora had grown up the daughter of a schoolmaster in a village that had mostly liked her, and she had not known this kind of silence before. She learned it at Ashwick in the days after the brooch. The second incident happened 3 weeks later, and it was more deliberate than the first. The Duke of Ashwick arrived on a Tuesday in November, without announcement. His name was Everard Pethwick, the 8th Duke, 34 years old, and he had been in the north, managing an entailed property in Yorkshire for the better part of 7 months. He came back to Ashwick because his solicitor had written twice with urgency, and because something in his own chest had grown tired of the northern grey. He arrived in the evening, took cold meat in his study, and was in bed before the house had properly roused itself to receive him. He was not what Nora had imagined from the Duchess's references to him. The Duchess spoke of the Duke with the careful courtesy of a woman who knew the limits of her position and resented every inch of them. She said his name with one particular flatness, the way a person says the name of a weather event they have grown accustomed to enduring. Nora had inferred a man whose presence pressed down on those around him. What she found when she encountered the Duke in the gallery the following morning was a man who stood at the window with a quality of contained stillness, looking at the grounds in the thin November light, as though he were trying to locate something he had misplaced in the landscape. She had not intended to be in the gallery. She had come for the window dressings, which Mrs. Pelling wanted beaten before winter set the dust further in. She had her back to the room and was unhooking the drapery from its bracket when she heard him. "You are new," he said. "Not a question." She turned. He was not looking at her with any particular intensity. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has registered on the edge of his attention, and that he is simply noting, the way you note the change in a familiar room. "Yes, Your Grace, since October." He looked at her for a moment longer. Something in his face was very still, and then it was still again, and he turned back to the window. She went back to the drapery. She did not permit herself to think about the way his attention had landed on her, brief as it was, the way a hand might settle on a surface and lift and leave no mark. And yet she was aware, at the base of her throat, of the pulse that said something had happened in the room. It was after this that the Duchess made her second move. The dinner party was planned for the 5th of November, a small gathering by Ashwick standards, 8 guests of county consequence. The Duchess organized it with the precision of a general who understood that the Duke's return required a show of managed prosperity. She assigned Nora to assist in the dining room rather than confining her to the upper floors, which was not the assignment Nora expected, and which carried, for those who understood the Duchess's methods, the quality of a deliberate placement. The event for which Nora was to serve as witness was this: a sealed letter, which the Duchess had written and which she had addressed in a clear hand to a moneylender in the city, was to be placed among the Duke's private correspondence on the hall table. The Duchess intended, should anyone inquire, to say she had observed the new maid handling the Duke's letters, which would establish both dishonesty and a possible interest in the household's financial affairs. The letter itself was not incriminating on its own terms. What it would establish, should the question arise, was a pattern of curiosity and transgression. What the Duchess had not accounted for was the hall table's position relative to the gallery's doorway, and she had not accounted for the Duke. He came down the gallery stairs at 6:45 before the guests had arrived, when the house was in that charged interval between the servants' preparations and the public performance. Nora was in the hall, carrying fresh candles for the dining room brackets. She set them on the table for a moment to adjust the bundle, and she saw the letter, the sealed one, the addressed one, the wrong one, sitting atop the Duke's private correspondence, where it had no business being. She did not pick it up. She looked at it. Then she looked at the placement of the letters around it, and something clarified in her, the way water clarifies when you stop disturbing it. "Miss Gilroy," said the Duke from 3 steps above her. She had learned his voice in one hearing. She looked up. He was watching the table. Not her, the table, and the letters on it, and the particular top letter with its particular address. She did not know what his face was doing, because his face was doing almost nothing. And yet she felt, with a certainty she could not have defended to anyone, that he had seen exactly what she had seen. "Leave them," he said. "The letters." "Yes, Your Grace." She took the candles and went into the dining room, and did not look back. The dinner proceeded. Nora moved through the room with the precision of a woman who had learned young that the best service is invisible, and the Duchess watched her from the head of the table with the patience of someone waiting for a particular moment to arrive. It did not arrive. Nora did not stumble. She did not produce any emotion the room might use. She served and withdrew and served again, and the guests ate and discussed the northern campaigns and the price of wool, and the state of the roads after the autumn rains, and the Duke sat at the foot of the table and listened more than he spoke. Once, and only once, she became aware that he was looking at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at women in service, with the particular vacancy that meant they were not really looking at a person at all. He was looking at her with the attentiveness of a man who has been trying to determine something and has just arrived at a provisional answer. She poured the claret for the guest to his left and felt the pulse at her wrist like a struck note. "The dismissive label," the Duchess said to Lady Whitmore during the second remove, in a voice pitched to carry past the footman without being loud enough to address the table, "is really that she has no reference worth speaking of, entirely unknown. One does what one can in a provincial house." Lady Whitmore's eyebrows arranged themselves into polite sympathy. The Duke, 2 seats away, said nothing. He was examining the stem of his glass. After the guests had gone, after the house had settled into its night posture, Nora was collecting the last of the extinguished tapers from the corridor brackets when she heard the door to the Duke's study open. She was at the far end of the corridor with her back to the light, and she did not move. "Miss Gilroy," said the Duke. She turned. He was standing in the study doorway with the sealed letter in his hand. He held it the way a man holds something he has no further use for, not casually, but with the deliberate looseness of a decision already made. "Do you know what this is?" he said. "I have not read it, Your Grace." "No." He looked at her steadily. "I did not think you had." He set the letter on the console table beside the door, face down. "I will speak with Mrs. Pelling in the morning. You will remain in your position. I would ask that you disregard any instruction that comes to you regarding the family correspondence from any source." She looked at him. Something inside her that had been very tightly arranged began, carefully, to ease. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He said nothing further. He went back into the study and closed the door, and she stood in the dark corridor for a moment, with the taste of something she could not name sitting in the back of her throat. If you have stayed this long, you already know the Duchess had not yet played her final card. Leave a thought below if you have ever watched a confidently wrong person begin to realize they have miscalculated. It is a peculiar thing to witness. She had allies. Every woman of the Duchess's position had allies, because a woman of that position had spent years distributing small, carefully calibrated courtesies that accumulated into social debt. She had Lady Whitmore, who owed her a word let fall in the right direction 3 years ago. She had Mr. Hatch, the nearest magistrate, who had dined at Ashwick regularly and understood that his continued warmth of reception depended on a certain alignment. And she had the particular confidence of a person who had never, in 11 years of careful navigation, been caught in anything that could be named directly. What she lacked was an accurate picture of the Duke. Everard Pethwick had been away from Ashwick for 7 months, not because he disliked his estate, but because the house, under his stepmother's management, had begun to feel to him like a room in which all the furniture had been moved slightly from where it belonged. Nothing was wrong enough to confront. Everything was subtly displaced. He had removed himself to Yorkshire, partly because the property required attention, and partly because he had learned, in the 34 years of his life, that there were battles worth fighting and battles worth waiting out. He had been waiting for 3 seasons to understand what precisely he was dealing with at Ashwick. The letter clarified it. It was not a letter to a moneylender. He had seen at a glance that it was addressed in the wrong hand for the business address it claimed. It was addressed, in fact, in his stepmother's own careful script, with the deliberate errors of a woman trying to disguise her writing and not quite accounting for the characteristic lift of her uppercase E. He had been a man who paid attention to what was directly in front of him since the age of 7, which was when his first mother had taught him to notice the things that people assumed you were not watching. It was the most useful thing she had ever given him. He burned the letter that evening in the study grate. What followed in the weeks after the dinner was a kind of suspended interval in which the Duchess recalibrated. She was not a woman who abandoned a strategy. She was a woman who set it aside while she identified the failure in its execution. She was cordial to Nora in the upper corridor, the particular cordial of a person who is no longer bothering to be otherwise because she has moved her pieces somewhere else. Nora cleaned and pressed and carried trays and said very little to anyone, and in the evenings she read her father's dictionary by the light of her room's single candle. Not for any practical purpose, but because the shape of his handwriting in the margins was as close as she could come to him. She had not permitted herself to think about the Duke. She thought about him constantly. The third incident, the final one, was of the Duchess's most elaborate construction. And it was also the one that revealed what she had never intended to show. The occasion was a charity subscription, organized by the county gentry for the relief of soldiers' widows. The Duchess had positioned herself as its primary organizer and patron, which served both her genuine impulse toward generosity and her social interest in being seen as indispensable. The funds were to be collected at Ashwick Park in December, at a small morning assembly of the county's principal families. The Duchess would present the collected subscription to the vicar, who would convey it to the appropriate charitable institution. The sum collected, when the Duchess tallied it the evening before, was £47 and 16 shillings. The sum presented at the assembly from a sealed box that had stood on the morning room table since Thursday was £41. The Duchess announced this discrepancy with the expression of a woman who is distressed to report something she had hoped would not be necessary. She said she had noticed the seal slightly disturbed, that she had not wished to make accusations, but that given the difficult episode with the brooch in October, she felt it her duty to mention that only one new member of staff had access to the morning room over the preceding 2 days. Nora stood at the edge of the room with a salver of tea glasses and felt the assembly's attention turn toward her the way weather turns. Lady Whitmore's face arranged itself into the expression of a woman who has had her suspicions confirmed. The vicar's wife looked at the floor. The housekeeper's hands were perfectly still, but Nora had learned to read Mrs. Pelling, and something behind the woman's eyes had gone the particular still of controlled alarm. The Duchess said, with the warmth of a woman speaking a charity that cost her personally, "She is a provincial girl, with no people. I do not believe her wicked. I believe her desperate." No one in the room answered her. The Duke entered from the garden door. He was still in his riding coat, which meant he had come directly from the grounds. He had not been invited to the assembly, which had been organized as a morning event for the ladies. And yet, here he was. And every person in the room felt the change in the atmosphere, the way you feel a door open onto cold air. He stood just inside the threshold and looked at his stepmother. "I removed £6 and 4 shillings from the subscription box on Thursday morning," he said. "I intended to add a further contribution before the assembly. I neglected to leave a note." He looked at the vicar. "I will provide the full accounting to your institution by end of week, with the balance and a supplementary donation of £10 from the estate." Silence. The Duchess's face was doing something she had not intended it to do. It was doing, for a moment, and a moment only, the thing that a person's face does when they have made a miscalculation so fundamental that the correction of it cannot be quietly absorbed. Something cracked behind her composure, not loudly, but visibly, the way ice cracks before it goes. "I was not aware," she said. "No," said the Duke. He looked at her steadily. "You were not." The silence that followed was witnessed by 11 women, the vicar's wife, and a footman who would describe the moment later to Mrs. Pelling with the hushed specificity of a person who understood they had seen something that would be discussed for some time. And there, at the edge of the room, holding a salver of untouched tea glasses, Nora became aware that she was not invisible. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his stepmother with the calm of a man who had been waiting to understand something, and has now understood it completely. But she felt, with the full force of her body, that the room had shifted on its axis, and that she was standing in a place she had not been standing in that morning. If you have stayed all the way to this moment, you have stayed for exactly this moment, the instant before everything becomes clear. Whatever you're feeling now, put it in a comment below. I will be reading. Nora had a conversation with no one for 3 days afterward. She went about her duties with the particular precision of a person concentrating too hard on a simple task, which is the body's way of managing something that will not be managed. She polished the second-floor sconces until they outshone what they had been in years. She folded linens with the care a person brings, only to things they cannot say. On the 4th day, the Duke appeared at the morning room door while she was setting the grate. He waited until she had finished. She was aware of this the way you are aware of the temperature in a room, without looking directly at the source of it. She set the brush and pan aside and stood and turned. "You have been in this house since October," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "You found the brooch." "Yes, Your Grace." "You saw the letter on the table." She did not answer immediately. This was, she understood, one of those moments in which the next sentence was not like the others. It was the kind of sentence that crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "I saw a letter that did not belong with the others," she said. "I did not know what it was. I did not touch it." He looked at her for a moment, and his face was still. And then it was not quite still. Something moved in it. Briefly. That was not quite coldness and not quite warmth, but was the step between them, the particular expression of a man in whom warmth has lived so long under stone that it has forgotten how to surface and is trying now to find the way up. "Miss Gilroy," he said, "are you content in this house?" She could have said yes. It was the obvious answer, the safe one, the one that kept everything in its proper place. She could hear exactly how her voice would sound saying it. "I was content enough," she said. "Before October." He was silent for a moment. "Before October," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He moved to the window, not with the air of a man ending a conversation, but with the air of a man who needs a moment in which neither of them is looking directly at the other. Outside the glass, the park was gray with December, and the oaks had been stripped entirely by the recent wind, and the landscape had that stripped quality that makes everything look very far away. "My stepmother will be removing to the Dower House," he said, "before Christmas. It has been long deferred." Nora said nothing. "You will remain in your position," he said, "for as long as you choose." He turned from the window. "I would not have you think your choosing has limits." She felt, behind the careful arrangement of her expression, something open in her chest that she had not known was closed. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was somewhere in it. It was more the feeling of a room when the window is opened, and the air changes, and you realize you had stopped noticing the room was close. The morning room was quiet around them. The fire she had set was beginning to take properly, the room warming from the knees upward the way a room does when the cold has been in it all night. The light through the windows was the flat gray light of a December morning, and it landed on the mantelpiece, on the chairs, on the space between them with an even-handedness that made everything in the room equally present. His coat was the color of winter water. His hands, she noticed, were very still at his sides, the hands of a man who has learned to hold himself at measured cost. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the space between them held everything that had not yet been said, which was considerable, and everything that had been said, which was exactly enough. She went back to her duties. The Duchess received the news of the Dower House that same afternoon, in the Duke's study, in what Mrs. Pelling described to the housekeeper's assistant as a conversation of brief duration and great clarity. What precisely passed between stepmother and stepson was not witnessed, but the Duchess emerged from the study with the expression of a woman who has contested a verdict and found the court unmoved. She did not summon Nora to the upper corridor. She did not speak to her at all. She began the business of her removal with the efficiency of a woman who has understood that efficiency is now the only domain remaining to her. The estate solicitor, Mr. Haverford, arrived on a Thursday with papers. He was a brisk man with excellent whiskers and the manner of someone who had conveyed a great many decisions from a great many dukes to a great many parties who had not expected them, and he carried the business with the particular neutrality of his profession. The Duchess's settlement was generous. The Duke had been, in this as in most things, more than the law required. He was simply firm. The morning she left, snow was falling in earnest, the first real snow of the season. Nora saw the Duchess's carriage from the upper corridor window, the luggage on the roof and the footman's breath in the cold air. and she watched without triumph, because she was not built for triumph. What she felt was something quieter. It was the feeling of a thing that has been correctly settled, the way you feel when a crooked picture has been straightened on a wall and the room is finally legible again. She thought of her father, who had believed that correctness had a weight to it, that it settled into place with a specific gravity that the careless could not counterfeit. She thought of his dictionary in her room, his handwriting in the margins, the careful way he had underlined words he found beautiful. The word he had underlined twice, she remembered, was one she had learned at 11 and considered too plain for its underlinings until she was much older. The word was witness. Someone had to be in the room. Someone had to see. December passed into a quiet Christmas. The house arranged itself without the Duchess into something that felt less like a performance and more like an inhabited place. The footmen moved differently in the corridors. Mrs. Pelling stopped measuring her words to 2 decimal places. The kitchen was warm on the 23rd and 24th, the smell of spiced apples coming up through the servants' stair in a way it had not, Nora gathered, in some years. The Duke asked her to walk with him on Christmas Eve. He said it plainly, in the upper corridor, after she had finished with the linens. He said there was something he wished to show her on the grounds, and the day was clear for the first time in a week. And would she come? He did not say it in a way that anticipated refusal or required an answer of any particular kind. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say and is done calculating the risk of. She said yes. They walked the east grounds in the thin winter light, the park laid out in white and gray with the odd brown of the old grass showing through where the wind had swept the snow into ridges. He showed her the beach avenue, the long double row of trees that had been planted by his grandfather and that were, in leaflessness, more beautiful than in summer, the branches against the sky like a kind of writing she could not quite decipher. He showed her the kitchen garden's winter frame, the old stone wall around it with its moss still holding its green despite the cold. He did not speak very much. Neither did she. They walked at the proper distance of 2 people who are being careful, and yet the care itself had warmth in it, the warmth of 2 people who know what they are being careful about. She was aware of him in the particular way she had been aware of him since the gallery. It was not a dramatic awareness, nothing that announced itself. It was the simpler thing of knowing, without looking, precisely where another person is in a space, the way you know where a candle is in a dark room, not by the light it makes, but by the heat it gives at a distance. She could feel the warmth of him at 6 paces, which was not a reasonable thing to feel in December, and she was sensible enough to know it had nothing to do with temperature. The snow was firm underfoot, and the cold had that particular December quality of being dry rather than bitter, the kind that reddens a face without being unkind about it. Her boots were adequate. She had been careful to wear the ones with the double sole. Somewhere above them, a blackbird moved in the bare branches of the avenue's canopy, and the small sound of it, one bird in all that white silence, was somehow the most specific thing in the world. At the far end of the beach avenue, he stopped. "You said," he said, "that you were content enough before October." "Yes," she said. He looked at the avenue. "And after October? Once the matter was settled?" She considered this carefully. The cold had brought color to her face, and her breath showed in the air. And she was wearing her good coat, the pressed one she had arrived in, and her hands were in her gloves, and the world was very still. "I have been afraid to answer that honestly," she said. He looked at her then, a full, direct look, and she felt it in the length of her spine. "Answer it," he said. She looked at the snow on the avenue, at the bare beech branches, at the ridge of the park wall against the white sky. "I have been more than content," she said. "And that is a more complicated thing to be, in this house, in my position." She paused. "I was not sure whether what I felt was something that existed between two people, or whether it was something I had made up out of loneliness and gratitude." "And which is it," he said, "that you think now?" "I think," she said carefully, looking at him, "that it is something that exists between two people." He was silent for a moment. Around them the park held its winter quiet, and the snow settled on the beaches in small increments that she could barely hear. And somewhere in the avenue, a bird moved in a high branch. "Nora," he said. Her name, the given name, in his voice for the first time. It was the only time he used it in the park. It was enough. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He turned toward her, and she turned toward him, and the distance between them held for one more beat. The breath of the cold air and the light of the pale December sky. And then he offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked back toward the house together at the pace of two people who are no longer being careful about anything except each other. The marriage was announced in January, and the county's reaction was what such reactions always are. The portion of the county that had already understood quietly was unsurprised, and the portion that had taken its cues from the Duchess had a revision to perform, which it performed with the practiced smoothness of people long accustomed to performing revisions. Lady Whitmore said she had always thought the girl had exceptional quality. Mrs. Pelling held the announcement with the expression of a woman in whom satisfaction is so complete that it cannot yet find a proper shape. By February, Nora Gilroy was the Duchess of Ashwick. She was, at her installation, precisely as she had always been. Direct in her address, careful in her attention, generous with the kitchen girls and firm with those who required firmness, and possessed of an absolutely level gaze that had dismayed people all her life, and that she had long since decided was not something she was prepared to alter for anyone's comfort. She ran the house the way her father had kept his schoolroom, which was to say with the conviction that the persons in it were worth the attention. The servants took to it within a month. The county took somewhat longer. It took the county, specifically, until April, when Nora organized the spring distribution to the soldiers' widows from the charitable subscription and presented the accounting at the vicar's quarterly assembly with such unimpeachable completeness that Lady Whitmore said, over biscuits afterward, that she had always believed systematic charity to be the true mark of a well-organized household. The vicar's wife agreed. Even Mr. Hatch, who had recalibrated his loyalties over the winter with the practiced ease of a man who has done this before, found something commendatory to say about the new Duchess's clear head. Nora accepted these revised opinions with the composure of a woman who had learned, very thoroughly, not to depend on them. The old Duchess remained in the dower house, where she had, after some months, the particular opportunity that is available only to those who have been conclusively corrected. She could see, from where she stood, what the house had become. She was never cruel again. Not in that particular deliberate way. What she became instead was cautious and somewhat diminished, and on occasion genuinely rueful, which is a different thing entirely from defeat, and is, in the economy of this kind of story, precisely what she had earned. The amber brooch Nora found behind the vanity leg stayed in its drawer. She had seen the first Duchess's portrait in the gallery, a woman with a quiet face and excellent hands, and she felt no desire to displace her. The drawer was a sufficient home for the brooch. Ashwick had enough room for the women who had loved it. On the last evening of February, after the house had settled and the fire in the sitting room had burned to its comfortable low state. Everard sat opposite her in the chair he had claimed as his, the one with the slightly worn arm where he rested his right hand while he read. She had her father's dictionary in her lap, though she was not reading it. She was sitting with the weight of it, which was its own kind of reading. He looked up from his book. "You are thinking," he said. "I often am," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had begun, over the months, to sit more easily on his face, the one she could now read as clearly as her father's handwriting in a margin, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his particular good fortune, and is not going to say so, because saying so would not capture it accurately, and he has never been a man who speaks inaccurately. She opened the dictionary to the page she had remembered, the page with the word underlined twice in her father's hand. She thought of the morning she had arrived at Ashwick Park, the frost-wet ground and the pressed coat and the schoolmaster's dictionary in the trunk behind her. She had come into this house with nothing she could spend. What she had was her father's belief, worn smooth by handling. Correctness had gravity. Worth, left unremarked long enough, eventually pressed itself into notice. That the thing which could not be counterfeited was the quality of attention a person brought to a room. Someone had to be in the room. Someone had to see. Outside the sitting room window, February snow was falling on the park, the same park she had walked with him in December, the beach avenue now under white, and the kitchen garden wall with its green moss holding still under the cold. The fire gave off its particular warmth, and the dictionary was warm in her hands, and her husband was reading 6 feet away, and the house around them was the house she had made from the one she had walked into, which is to say it was entirely, specifically hers. The snow fell. The fire held. And somewhere in the corridor, the clock said the hour. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nora's story moved you, leave a comment and tell me the moment that stayed with you longest.